Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar about the current political situation and social crisis in Ecuador. My name is Patrick Clark, and I'm a Sirleck Fellow and a Sessional Assistant Professor in the Department of Social Science here at York. So thank you so much for joining us today for this event. I think it's very important and a timely discussion. We wanted to put something together to discuss this really difficult time that Ecuador is living through. So just to begin, I want to do the land acknowledgement. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. We're coming to you from Sirleck Center in the Kiel campus of York University in Takaranto, the area traditionally known as Takaranto, and it's been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat historically. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. And we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And just as we start this, I want everyone to reflect on that and also reflect on our relationships, right, with Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Here at Sirleck, we work in all, regional center, and these kind of dialogue and spaces for dialogue are very important for reconciliation. So I want us to all think about that as we start this event. So first off, I'm going to introduce our other kind of moderator for today, Emeritus Professor at York in Political Science, Lisa North, and Sirleck Fellow. We put this together, this event together. And we're just waiting. Carlos Larrea, our main speaker today, is joining us in a couple of minutes. He's just running a little bit late. So I will just turn it over to Lisa, and she's going to introduce Carlos. Yeah.
Okay. So here we are, Patrick and myself. I'm especially pleased to introduce Carlos Larrea, since I have literally known him for decades. I have known him for decades since I was a member of his doctoral supervisory committee at York. Carlos completed his doctorate in social and political thought at this university in 1993. That's quite a few years ago. He is now actually a retired professor at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito. And at the Andina, he set up and directed the one and only graduate program in climate change that is available in Latin America. During what is still an ongoing career, he has written hundreds of articles and quite a few books on themes of social justice and social inequality, on Indigenous peoples' lack of access to land, on the depredation of the Amazonian region, on environmentally and socially desirable alternatives to mining. These are among many of the very, very urgent kinds of issues that he has dealt with in his research. In his very long list of publication, which is often co-authored with teams of students or with teams of colleagues, I would like to mention only one book. Universidad Andina published work on the environmental history of Ecuador. It's a Andina Publishing House bestseller, and it is a book that I encourage you to find on the Andina publishers lists and to get it for yourselves. Beyond all that I have mentioned, Carlos has worked for just about every international organization that you can name, United Nations, OAS, Pan American Union, Health Organization, so forth and so on. So I will now turn you over to Carlos, if he has managed to join us, because he is trying to join us to talk about the causes and dimensions of the violence that is taking place in Ecuador. Hello, Carlos, you have made it. Great to see you. Okay, adelante, profesor.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, I am trying to share my screen. Okay, so the topic of my presentation today is linked with the recent disruption of a very, very strong degree of violence in the case of Ecuador. We try to present some structural roots of this process and try to understand why it is happening and what will be the future effects as far as we can predict them. Let's begin with some basic data about what happened in Ecuador. Actually, along its Republican history, actually, Ecuador has been, for a long period of time, one of the most peaceful countries in Latin America, particularly in the Andean region. As you know, Colombia has been affected by a 50-year civil war and a very, very strong guerrilla activity. In the case of Peru, our southern neighbor, we have also a situation with Sendero Luminoso and Shining Path and other violent activities coupled with very authoritarian regimes. In the case of Ecuador, we didn't have that. We have a more stable and peaceful process of social evolution, and also the degree of street violence has been very, very low in Ecuador. So here we have the evolution of the homicide rate between 1990 and the present for several selected Latin American countries. In dark blue, we have the case of Ecuador. And actually, Ecuador has, let's suppose in 2018, about 6 years ago, a rate of about 6 homicides per each 100,000 inhabitants. And suddenly, this figure scaled up very quickly, particularly after 2020. And now we have above 45 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, which is actually a very, very high rate. As a way to comparison, I included the case of Colombia. Actually, in Colombia, the homicide rate has been declining mostly as a result of the peace process. But now Ecuador has almost twice the Colombian rate. And even in the case of Venezuela, which has been one of the most violent countries in Latin America, actually in the last years in Venezuela also homicide rates are declining, so that actually Ecuador is becoming one of the most violent countries in Latin America. We have the case of Mexico, which is famous also by its violence. However, Ecuador now has also a higher rate compared with Mexico. So what happened? And secondly, why? That is, I would like to present some elements for a contribution, trying to answer this couple of questions. The first point, that's very, very important, that I would like to present is the evolution, the recent evolution, according to the United Nations, of the coca cultivating area, the coca planted area in several Latin American countries. Actually, almost all of cocaine comes from Latin America, particularly from South America. And the origin of cocaine production almost completely is located in 3 South American countries: Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. And here we have the UN estimations about the area cultivated with coca. And in the case of Colombia, since 2010, actually this area has a very, very impressive role, increasing by about threefold in 11 years. In the case of Peru, the increase is also very high, particularly if we compare it with 2015, we have about a 15% increase. So first, this data shows us that actually the policy of combating or trying to reduce drug trafficking in Latin America based on mostly on repressive policies in producer countries actually failed. Is a complete failure because we are expecting a reduction in coca cultivating area, and we have at least a twofold expansion in the last 10 or 15 years. That is why we need a changing policy. That's the first conclusion. Secondly, actually, what I am going to present is the link between mostly what happened in Colombia. Peru is also important, but the most important part of my argument is linked with Colombia. What is happening in Colombia and why we have this expansion of violence in the case of Ecuador. Here we have a very recent analysis also made by United Nations about where in Colombia we had this kind of very, very quick and strong and recent expansion in coca cultivated area. And we found a very interesting analysis that two departments in Colombia are similar to provinces in Ecuador. Two departments, Nariño and Putumayo, both located in the border with Ecuador. They are linked with Ecuador, are concentrated about 80% of the recent expansion in coca cultivated area. We can see it more clearly in the next map, which show us the expansion in 2021 and 2022. In red, we have the most dramatically expanded areas. In this part, this is the Amazon region. In the Amazon region, this is the border is the Putumayo River. That's why the department's name is Putumayo. And almost all the expansion in the Amazon took place in the Putumayo. And the other region is the coast. And here we have the Tumaco region, and the department is named Nariño. And also we have in red the huge expansion that took place recently. This is just located very, very close to the Ecuadorian border. So we have also some small expansion in the Venezuelan border, but actually almost all the expansion took place here in the south, in the border with Ecuador. So what happened? Actually, that all this cocaine produced and processed in Colombia is now exported from Ecuador. And this dramatic expansion of coca production in the south of Colombia is the result of an incomplete and fragmented peace process between the government of Colombia and the guerrilla activity, particularly the FARC, which was used to be the strongest, the largest guerrilla group in Colombia. Several small groups that didn't take part in the peace accord actually became gangs groups linked with the narco-trafficking. And the Putumayo and the Nariño are the areas where these groups were mostly located. And for them to export cocaine illegally from Colombia is very, very difficult. So they prefer to send the processed drug to Ecuador, and from Ecuador send it to the rest of the world, particularly the US and Europe. The problem is that after the death of the destruction of the Medellin cartel and the death of Pablo Escobar, actually gangs linked to cartels were fragmented, and now we have Mexican cartels, Colombian cartels, and other international cartels that work integrated into different groups, and we have a conflict between two very, very large cartels within Ecuador, and as a result of a war, internal war between the cartels, violence exploded in Ecuador. That is the historical reason because we have this situation. But we also are interested in analyzing why the state or the government in Ecuador, the state apparatus, was able to compensate or to fight this huge drug expansion. And we are moving to an analysis of the recent evolution of Ecuador's economy. Ecuador has been an oil exporter country for about half a century, about 50 years. However, the problem is that oil reserves are running out in the case of Ecuador, and oil exports in Ecuador actually are declining very, very strongly, particularly in the last 10 years since 2014. Here in blue, we have the share or the participation of oil in total export purchasing power in Ecuador. Ecuador is a very has a very low export diversification. In addition to oil, the country exports bananas, fish products, or sea products, mostly shrimp and fish, and cocoa, coffee, flowers, and so on. But actually, as you can see, since 10 years ago, oil export declined very, very sharply, and now they are about less than half of the value they used to have in 2014. So Ecuador is facing a very, very strong economic crisis, and the state apparatus is extremely weak to present a real alternative strategy to this expansion of violence. Here we have the sources of government revenue in the Ecuador, and also in blue, we have the participation of oil revenues in the state budget. And actually, we have a very strong decline. We have a maximum in 2011 with about more than a third of state revenues coming from oil, and now the percentage is very close to 10%. So we have a very, very strong decline in oil revenues, and we don't have an expansion of other sources. For example, income tax didn't actually, it grow, but not enough. Here we have the value-added tax, which is the gray, the orange is income tax. So actually, we are facing a very serious problem of a strong fiscal deficit. So the state barely is able to pay salaries of the public sector, and doesn't have the capacity neither to invest or to expand actually the police and the armed forces, the military, to control the expansion in violence in the country. That is why the situation became very, very critical in the last couple of months. President Noboa, a new president who took power just 6 months ago or so, he declared a state, officially declared a state of internal war in the country, and a state of exception at the national level for about 6 months. And now we are in a situation of emergency, which actually seems to have produced some initial important results in terms of a recent reduction in violence, but we don't know whether or not it will be a lasting change or just a short-term transformation. To have an idea of the size, of the magnitude of the problem, I am going to present two very interesting figures. The first, how many people are linked to drug gangs in Ecuador? And obviously, we cannot know it by sure, but we have some more or less credible estimations. And one of the most credible ones is the one presented by Fernando Carrion, who is an expert in the topic, and he calculated that 50,000 people are linked with drug gangs in Ecuador. 50,000 is higher than the size of the Ecuadorian army. The Ecuadorian army has 40,000 people, and more or less the same of the size of the police, which is 60,000 people. So it's very, very strong, the number. Secondly, laundering, drug laundering reaches about 5% of GDP in Ecuador. It's very, very high. We are talking about $3.5 billion per year, which is more or less about half of oil exports. That is a very, very high value, which is also a very worrying situation. Well, that's from some important data about it, but I will also like to present some results of the penetration of drug gangs in the state apparatus. Actually, the most important chiefs of police in the former government, in the government of Lasso, were working for the cartels. And the same is happening with the president of the National Court of Justice in Ecuador. So actually, they penetrated the highest levels of both the judicial and the police system. They have a very, very strong influence in local governments. Actually, several candidates to mayor in different municipalities in Ecuador were killed in the last election, and also some mayors have been killed in the recent months in the case of Ecuador. So the situation is extremely difficult. We have a combination of a very, very strong corruption system and drug trafficking. Actually, Ecuador ranks among the most corrupted countries in Latin America, according with Transparency International. That is the situation. So the degree of penetration of drug cartels in the political system is very high, and it's very difficult to change. So I would like to finish this very short presentation just introducing you to three possible outcomes that in the middle term can happen in Ecuador. The first of them, which I am very sad to say that, but it is not just a fear that it actually can happen, is that Ecuador are going to be transformed in a failed state in the next couple of maybe 10 years or so, with a process of expanding control of illicit activities that actually will be able to take part of the state apparatus. Well, we have failed states in Latin America. The most evident one is the case of Venezuela, which is actually a country which is in a process of disintegration. And we have also similar situations in some Central American countries. I think the case of Mexico is not very far from its outcome, so the situation is difficult. The second option can be limited by partial control of drug trafficking, but maintaining the current extractivist paradigm. That means maintaining a development model based mostly on oil and mining, which is not going to generate social development, is going to keep a very strong environmental effect. And the country will lack in the medium and long term both social development, economic diversification, and also we will have at the same time a strong environmental deterioration. That's more or less the way in which Ecuador is performing now. But we have a third possibility, which it is not it will not be obvious that it will be possible, but Ecuador has a strong potential for following this third path, which will be a transition towards a more equitable and sustainable society and economy, with nature conservation and expansion of tourism and biodiversity-based services. That is possible because Ecuador is one of the most biodiverse countries in the planet. Ecuador has a very, very strong tourist expansion possibilities, and also has a quite diverse cultural heritage. That is why a transformation of Ecuador following a model that can be some more or less similar to that followed by Costa Rica can be possible. The second option might be similar to one that it is going on in Peru, and the third option will be that Ecuador will become in the next years a country with a crisis as deep as the one we have in Venezuela. So this will be a kind of possibilities in the future. I am not able to predict which one will be the following paths in Ecuador, but I think the situation is quite difficult, and obviously we by sure don't have yet a workable solution of the problem of violence and drug trafficking in the country. That is why I don't believe the situation is going to be solved in several months or in the short term. The problem is rather a structural problem with very deep roots and international connections. That is why I am very worried about the future of my country. Well, this is my very short introduction to the topic, and I will be delighted to share with you some comments and discuss more in depth about the situation in Ecuador. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much for an excellent introduction to the topic. We will now ask a couple of questions. I'll ask a couple of questions. Patrick will ask a couple of questions, and then Patrick is going to check in on the Q&A and see what the people online are asking. So my question to start off the discussion is, how has the military reacted to the events that have taken place? And how has the military reacted to the declaration of the state of emergency? The Ecuadorian military historically has been quite enlightened. And it was actually military governments that pursued agrarian reforms, or started to legislate or decree social policies and so on. So what has the military reaction been?
Yes, well, I would like to try to answer this question beginning with this historical overview about the role in military in Ecuador. We have a military presence in several Latin American countries. The worst case can be the Southern Cone, the case of Pinochet in Chile, or the military dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. But in Ecuador, the situation has been just the opposite. Military policies in Ecuador has been strongly linked with some popular demands. Actually, the military governments promoted the two agrarian reform laws in Ecuador. They promoted import substituting industrialization in the 60s and 70s, and they promoted a change, a modernization of the state apparatus in several ways in the past. That is the background. Secondly, actually, the link between military participation and social needs has been strong in Ecuador. So actually, after the militarization of the fight against drug trafficking, which took place about a month ago, actually, what I can say in the short term, because it's just less than a month of that, is first that the military presence has been very, very effective. We have actually a dramatic reduction in the killings in the streets, more than 50% decline in the homicide rates in the last month, which is very, very strong. Also, a very important group of leaders of the gangs which are in jail. And actually, there are about more than 3,000 people in jail now as a result of different actions of the military. So in the short term, we have a more or less effective action of the military in the fight against this internal conflict. Secondly, people are very happy. Actually, we have a poll, our opinion poll, and the rate of approval of the president is 85%.
Oops.
Which never happened in Ecuador in the past. 85% of popularity of President Noboa just 3 weeks after this state of emergency. Because people actually are very, very happy that they are not going to have this kind of violence, this kind of extortions, because these gangs are financed partially by extortion to small businesses. So people now is free to have a restaurant or to have a small store or whatever activity without having to pay to the neighboring gangs. This kind of vacunas in Spanish, yeah. So this is the short-term situation. I am not sure. What seems to me very clear is that the military has been so far effective. The military action has been so far effective. I'm not sure whether or not it's going to last. Actually, the military are very clear that the problem is not only a problem of application of force. They want to combine that with employment generation and social change. That's what they say. So it's not just repression, no. But I don't know how the government is going to deal with the situation in the next months. It is not clear for me how this transformation is going to continue.
Okay, thank you very much. Can
I cannot hear you very well.
also about the police, because the police, is there any possibility? What is happening with the balance of
Well, in the case of the police, we have
action between the military and of repressive action, a part of the two?
we have a change in the highest echelons of the police before the change. So we now have new generals in the police. It was completely renovated. So many of the most corrupt generals, or identified as possibly corrupt generals, were separated of the institution, and now the higher echelons of the police are new.
Okay.
And there is a strong coordination. That's what we are informed. We don't know the details between the police and the military. So it seems that the initial strategy is working. That's my perception of this. I'm not sure whether or not it's going to last. Probably no. But because the capacity of the guns to recover is very high, and the amount of money involved in drug trafficking is also very high. So they have the money, they have the resources, but so far, I think they received a very, very strong deterioration.
Okay, one more question from me. While repression has been effective, have the human rights organizations, like the Comisión Ecuménica de Derechos Humanos, have they identified abuses or violations of civil liberties?
Well, I don't have a recent reports. Maybe they are already produced. I didn't read them, but I have information that we have important violation of human rights.
Okay.
So I think the problem of human rights will be a very important issue in the future and in the present as well.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't have yet statistical sources about the magnitude of human rights violations. But informally, I know that some of them are taking place.
But it is nevertheless very interesting that the military, or some of the military leadership, is arguing that repression cannot work in the long run, and what you need is socially progressive policies and employment generating policies, because that would be in line with the kind of initiatives that the military has taken place historically. Okay.
Yeah. That is the position of several of the most important chiefs of the military in Ecuador.
Okay. Patrick, your turn, before we turn it to the audience.
Yes, thank you so
Hello,
much,
Patrick.
Carlos. That was a fantastic.
Nice to see you.
You too, and thank you. That's such a fantastic bird's eye view of this whole terrible situation that Ecuador is in. And one thing that kind of I wondered if you could comment on is the sort of comparative aspects of this, and if there's lessons from other countries that have dealt with this? I mean, you sort of mentioned that with scenario 2. Perhaps scenario 2 is the best we can hope for at this point, at least containment. And I know that in Mexico during the crisis, right, people would always talk about the DF or the Mexico City as kind of the contained zone. Do you maybe also sort of regionally in Ecuador, do you think certain regions will, well, clearly the coast is more affected by this than the Quito. So if there are sort of comparative, historical, or international lessons that you think would be important to think about. And
Actually, yes, the problem is very, very, very differentiated from the regional perspective. Not all the country suffers the expansion of violence in the same way. Violence is concentrated first in the Colombian border, obviously, because it's very porous. It's very, we don't have roads. It's jungle. So actually, smuggling drug in the jungle is quite easy. And we have a border of 500 kilometers in the border with Colombia, which is very large. So violence in the Colombian border is very high. The most affected provinces is Esmeraldas, which is just in the border, and the way of transporting drugs goes through Los Rios, Manabí, and Guayas, which are provinces all in the coast. And actually, drug is leaving the country in very, very large shipments of banana exports, because there is not persons who go by plane, call it traditionally mulas, person that actually eat a small fraction of drug and go by plane. That is very, very low volume. The volume now is high. One of the last seizures of drug in the last weeks were something like 40 tons of cocaine, which is the value in the streets of New York will be more than $1 billion. So it is very, very high. And they go usually hidden in banana exporting ships, going mostly to the US and Europe. So the hot places are the harbors, Guayaquil, Manta, Puerto Bolívar, y Pozor. So this is the location of both exports and violence. And most of the harbor administration has been privatized. That is one of the reasons we have this huge expansion of illegal activities.
And then just on the, I think that's all very important to take into account. And in terms of international lessons, like, do you think that there's things that we could learn from, say, Colombia or Mexico, just comparatively, how they've dealt with this or not dealt well with their own internal crises around this for Ecuador?
Well, I think, well, we have some interesting results. For example, the case of I didn't study in deep, but for example, the situation of Medellin as a city. Actually, Medellin is a very safe city now in Colombia, and it used to be the most violent city in the world with Pablo Escobar. So how Medellin has been able to eliminate violence, I think it can be a positive narrative, and I think we can have some lessons from it. In my opinion, it's a combination of some effective policy action with social development, and that's why I think we need a significant transformation. Actually, the Colombian economy is working well. That's the difference with Ecuador. Yeah, in Colombia we have some prosperity in terms of the legal part of the economy, which is the largest. Yeah. So and also I think that as a result of the peace process and some progressive activities that probably the new government in Colombia is promoting, Colombia can slowly overcome this dramatic situation. In Ecuador, the possibilities are less favorable. We are a dollarized economy. That is a disadvantage because it favors, it is easier for money laundering. Yeah. With a dollarized economy, a weak state, a lot of corruption, the situation in Ecuador is much more difficult as a starting point. But I think Ecuador needs to overcome this problem. So I have an expectation that the level of violence is going to keep declining, at least partially, in the next years. But it is very difficult to predict. So we need more time to see the results. The fiscal deficit is huge. The state is extremely weak now, and we need a fiscal reform. We need to expand dramatically state revenue to face these new requirements, and it is to be very difficult to be done in the short term. That is why we can predict a situation of deterioration more or less similar to what happened in several Central American countries, which is very, 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 very difficult. The case of Guatemala and so on.
Okay.
That's great.
Patrick,
Yeah,
you want to check on the questions, Q&A?
Yeah, now we'll go to our questions from the audience. So I'm gonna just kind of go down in order that they're coming in. So the first question is around, do Western international agencies, World Bank, IMF, have a role in creating outcome number 3 rather than outcome 2? So this is talking about, the transformative vision, strengthening tourism as one of the main sectors in the economy. What can international institutions do?
Why don't you read?
Well, I think, yeah, it might be possible. It might be possible, particularly in the case of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and also the Andean Bank of Foments, the CAF. However, well, the traditional supported more or less a kind of neoliberal transformation of the state, which is more in line with scenario 2. Nevertheless, I think if the state have a well-defined policy, I think the possibility of getting international support for example, reducing deforestation, preserving the Amazon basin, and accelerate or deepening an energy transformation policy in Ecuador is feasible. And I think international institutions can support it. But everything depends on what the state actually is going to promote. And this is not sure now. So far, most of the last governments in Ecuador are have been more aligned with this extractivist path, which will be scenario number 2.
Yeah. So just this has sort of already been covered, but for the next question, it's just around dollarization. Whether that could be reversed, because clearly that's part of the story here, right? That's facilitating this. So do you think that that's an accurate assessment, that dollarization being a causal kind of factor in terms of the money laundering in particular? You've kind of covered that, but...
Yeah, well, actually dollarization has been has producing more or less favorable results in the case of Ecuador, because it avoided the mission of money printing, as happening in Venezuela with Chavez and Maduro. So as the country, as a dollarized economy, was not able to print money, actually Ecuador was able to survive without a huge inflation, and it generated a kind of stability in the country. That has been a good effect of dollarization in the last years. We have a very small economic growth, but we have stability. So how feasible will be in the future to continue with the dollarization is difficult to predict, because in order for dollarization to work, we need dollars. We need that economy will be working. And actually, in the situation, we are facing a very, very strong economic crisis as well. So if the country cannot find a way to transition away from extractivist activities, mostly oil and mining, the situation might be very difficult in the future. And dollarization can be in jeopardy. And that the situation will be very, very difficult to manage.
Yeah, great. No, good comments. So just, and again, just someone wants to come back to this question of extrajudicial killings, but also, the need to balance, obviously, responding to the current situation. So how can we kind of, the question is around how do we not end up with a local version of falsos positivos? I think this is maybe a reference to the Bukele type policy. Yeah.
Well, we need to have a very, very strong control, avoiding human rights problems, human rights abuses in Ecuador. So I think if the repression to drug trafficking is going to reinforce a kind of authoritarian regime, probably the negative effects might overcome the positive results. So I don't think the Salvadorian way will be stable in the future, because we need to go to the roots of the problem, and the roots of the problem is lack of employment, but very unequal society, and problems, very, very serious problems of inequality. So we need, at the same time, to generate employment, to reinforce the popular economy, both in the cities and in the countryside, and avoid the expansion of the illegal economy. And to do everything at the same time is very difficult. But I don't see other way to do that. So that is why I'm not sure that the model is going to work out. It can be failed. That is the situation. It's quite uncertain what is going to happen in Ecuador in the future.
Yeah. So the next two questions I'm going to combine two. One person was wondering about the role of different kind of political forces, so the right or extreme right political parties in the development of this internal conflict with the gangs and the corruption of the judiciary, suggesting that in Colombia, this has been more linked to right-wing parties. And then the second case is about, I think we all saw the terrible situation right in Guayaquil in the TV studio with very shocking, and that kind of brought a lot of international news. What is the role of the media in Ecuador in kind of reporting on this and informing the public? Is there sensationalism going on? And what about the protection of media freedom and freedom of speech in this current context? So
yeah, well, about the political system, I think it is important to point out that actually real political parties are almost not existent in Ecuador. Actually, as happening in Peru, as happening in several Latin American countries, actually we have in the last 10 or 15 years a process of destruction of reconstitution of political parties. And actually in Ecuador, we don't have a representative group of political parties. We have political forces. For example, the Correísmo, yeah, because Correa has been a very strong leader in the last 10 or 15 years, and it still has an important majority in the parliament and so on. But it is not it's not real. It's more like a movement, a social movement, more than a political party itself. We cannot identify strong forces as we have in Chile, for example, in the right wing, in the center, or in the left. So we have a process of disintegration of the political system instead. About the media, well, it's very important. The role of the media actually is very important as it is happening in all over the world. Actually, the media has been undergoing a very strong transformation. Written press has lost its influence. TV, conventional TV also. I think we have emerging ways of communication. For example, social networks, yeah, which are very important. TikTok and Facebook and this kind of ways of communication in which actually public opinion is expressing in new ways. So most of the media in Ecuador has been, the conventional media has been very conservative, and it is still very conservative. However, in this unconventional media is quite different. And for example, in the case of the Yasuni campaign, actually Ecuador witnessed a very important victory of environmentalist groups. The country decided it became the only oil exporting country that decided in a national consultation to keep oil in the ground in a national park. That's an unprecedented achievement, and all the media was against it. But the environmentalist thesis won by 59% of the support of population in Ecuador. This was the result of the influences of unconventional social networks, and young people. So there is a process of transformation of public opinion that's very, very strong in Ecuador now.
Yeah, no, and I mean that's happening all over the world. So do you think that there's also this kind of fear mongering or like through social networks around this? Like, I mean, there's probably rightfully, you know, a lot of fear. So that's definitely an ongoing issue to think about, how people get
Yes.
about all this. So just one kind of question, next question. How does Ecuador return to normality after the kind of emergency of the last months? Would Ecuadorian political elites or a fraction of them be tempted to resort to authoritarian ways to deal with criminality in the future? Sort of the Bukele, you know, model. Mm-hmm. Can this be linked to the way El Salvador dealt with gangs, leading to a normalization of mano duro at the level of public opinion? So where do you think that there's the kind of, I mean, we saw with the Salvadoran elections, right? They're clearly, Bukele has, what he got, his margin was, you know, huge, unprecedented, right? Yeah. Historically. So do you think that there's the same kind of appetite politically within the public opinion for those kind of policies? Because it can
happen in Ecuador. It can happen in Ecuador even with the current president. So the evolution towards a kind of authoritarian future model of state is feasible in Ecuador. It can happen. It is not a good idea because the democratic institutions are going to deteriorate strongly. But given the situation, it's a possible future evolution. But so I am not going to discard this kind of evolution. I hope it will not be the case. So I think it is very important to fight for the preservation of democratic institutions at the same time.
Yeah. Next questions was just sort of to circle back to the question of dollarization and corruption. What is the kind of causal link there potentially? even if dollarization, as you're saying, has these other impacts, which might be positive economically? How do you think that's maybe helped corruption or?
Yes, well, obviously, in a context of a weak state, a dollarized economy, money laundering probably is very high. I presented an estimate, $3.5 billion a year is a lot in a very small country like Ecuador. So it is very difficult to control as well. So we need also a parallel policy to fight corruption. Not only corruption in the public sector, but also corruption in the financial sector, which is quite difficult.
Yeah. People can ask more questions. We've just got one more left. It's actually from a Colombian, Johanna from Colombia. She's saying, following Medellin's long-term strategies, what could be the first step and which city should the initial efforts be focused on in Ecuador? I mean, the violence is worse in, say, Guayaquil or Manta or some of these other cities. So what might they do at a municipal level, and what kind of policies, jurisdictional authority would happen, and how can we think also about social policies and other things?
I think well, we need a combined effect of promoting safety, security, and at the same time generating employment. I think if we only go to the repressive way, the situation won't be lasting. And probably in a year or 2 years, we have another explosion of violence. So what we need is to avoid a combination of a short-term success with a long-term failure. And to do this, we need to promote social development at the same time. That is the key point that we need to take into account currently in the case of mostly Guayaquil, Duran, Manta, Esmeraldas, which are the cities, the most affected cities by violence.
Yeah. Great.
And it's very difficult.
One person was asking about the title of Carlos's book, so I just wanted to make sure that that's in there.
Okay. Carlos, el trabajo tuyo, your work on environmental history of Ecuador with the Andina. What is the title, precise title of that book? Historia ecológica o es historia.
Historia ecológica del Ecuador.
Historia ecológica del Ecuador. And a first edition was published in
2005.
2005, but now it's in second or third or whatever printing.
Yeah. We have a lot of reprintings. I don't know how many, but it has been a success in terms of readings.
Yeah. No, I was saying that it was a bestseller of the Andina Press.
Yes.
So, and it was the only title, that I mentioned of your many books. Okay, have you written anything on the presentation that you now gave that might be available and that we could circulate to the people who were listening to this presentation?
Yes, I agree.
Have you written anything? ¿Has escrito algo? Que ya do you have something written that you could circulate?
About it, not yet, but I have some my last publication was a policy brief that I published with the Science Panel for the Amazon about illegal activities in the Amazon. I can send you the digital version of that. It takes some information about what's going on in the Colombian border, linked with another illegal activities, such as not only drug trafficking, but also money laundering and illegal gold exports.
Okay.
That is the only one that I have already published. published it 2 months ago.
Okay, if you could send that to us, we could then circulate it among CERLAC fellows and perhaps also CALAC's, Canadian Association for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CALAC's members.
Yeah, excellent.
Because you're giving us permission to circulate it. There are no
of course,
copyright.
as much if you are willing to disseminate it, I'm very happy for your contribution, and we will be very happy as well in the science panel for the Amazon.
Okay, but in addition to that, if you, when you write up your analysis of the violence, could you send us a copy?
Of course. I'm going to. I think I published a very short article, very short, also in La Tercera in Chile about the roots of violence in Ecuador, but it has only 1 page. But I can send it to you as well.
Okay, that would be helpful, and we will circulate it among the people who tuned in to the presentation. Okay. Any other questions that have come in?
There are 2 more questions, actually, if you don't mind, Carlos. Maybe just before
no problem.
Make these the last questions. But one person was asking about, there's been the President of OAS talked about hiking the VAT. So could that actually work? Politically, do you think that's feasible? Well, you know, you were talking a bit about how income tax is declining, so maybe comment on relation to that. And then a last question is just around how are economic elites politically reacting to the current situation. So there's historically, we know, right, there's Ecuadorianness, this tension between, you know, elites from the highlands and the coast. So are people unanimously behind Noboa? Is there kind of a regional dimension to his power base, or are there tensions that would, you know, around how he's governing?
Could I add to it by asking, can you be a little bit more specific about what the position of Correa, you know, has been? Because you say that it is not a political party, and I agree with you. Certainly not a structured political party, but it is an important social movement. And Correa, of course, has a very strong following, and people listen to what he has to say. So the question is, what has he said, you know, about this? So can you combine Correa's reaction with elite reaction?
Yeah, excellent. Well, regarding the value-added tax and the way in which the fiscal deficit is going to be overcome. Actually, the easiest and most effective way in the short term to reduce the fiscal deficit probably will be to increase the value-added tax. But it has a regressive distributive effects. That's very important. What actually the country needs is to increase income tax. That means trying to get more money for the richest people in Ecuador, more money from the elites, so that actually the public spending might have a redistributive social effect. However, what happened yesterday and the day before yesterday in the assembly means that probably the solution in the short term will be mostly based on an increase in the value-added tax, which can solve the most urgent short-term problems, but won't be a good solution in terms of effects on inequality. That's the first point. I think regarding the position of the elites, the situation, Ecuador is probably facing the most severe, the deepest crisis we have, at least in 25 years. I think only in 1999, Ecuador has a situation as serious as severe as the one we are facing now. So in the short term, my impression is that elites are trying to save the country. They are really worried about the situation, and this might overcome some differences. That is why the government got approval of the assembly, the Congress, in several laws that he presented as a kind of emergency laws in the last 2 months. So in the short terms, we have a sense of unity, which I think is not going to last. But even Correa say that he might be accepting the good actions of the new president, which is surprising, taking into account the position that most the president, the ex-president Correa had in the past, which is denigrating all his political opponents. But now Correa understands that actually the popularity of Noboa, the new president, is so high that he must say that he agrees with the fight to cartels. So
he has agreed to the emergency measures.
In somehow he didn't criticize them strongly. He says that he might agree with that because actually probably he doesn't have a well-defined speech to face the current situation. He actually the Correísmo is still the most important political force in Ecuador. Yeah. They got more than 45% of the vote in the last presidential election. They didn't win the election, but actually they are the second most important social movement in Ecuador. And the coalition that elected President Noboa is quite heterogeneous. So actually, probably as a social movement, as a political movement, the Correísmo is still the dominant force in it. Yeah. And we have to take it into account. And they want to return to power. We are going to have national elections again in maybe 16 months or so. So the situation is still quite uncertain from the political perspective.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anything else? That okay, we can still go on for a few more minutes if you want to make any concluding remarks or if there's anybody else here who wants who has an urgent question. Do we have another question there?
Oh, that's an interesting. There is somebody asking about whether expats who've been moving to Ecuador, say Canadians, Americans, others, are they fleeing during these current tensions? And I mean, this whole problem with security as well does affect, Ecuador as a tourist destination. So maybe you could close with some remarks on that. That question just came in.
The relationship between tourism and security.
Yeah, and also just people who've migrated, like kind of retirement expats, people who've retired. Yeah.
Well, actually, Ecuador received a lot of retired people coming from North America, mostly. In the past, they were going, for example, to Cuenca, which is a very peaceful city with very good climate and so on. Tourism is the third most important economic activity in Ecuador after bananas and fishing and oil. Is the fourth one. But actually, obviously, the number of tourists declined strongly in the last couple of months as a result of violence. That is reasonable. Very embassies in different countries in the world recommended its citizens not to go to Ecuador because of the risk linked with violence that happened in the US and other countries. So that we have, for example, in Quito, more than 50% cancellation in the reserves of the hotels, which was an economic disaster. And it's going to continue for a while. However, if the problem will be, the evolution of the problem will be good enough, I think it's going to be a recovery. We expect more or less soon. Actually, Ecuador is has a very strong tourist potential. So I hope the situation is going to improve shortly. It depends on the result of the lasting results of the fight against drug cartels. As I said, nothing is sure now, but we might have some good expectations, taking into account what has been happening in the last weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. You displayed great stamina answering so many different questions from different perspectives over the last hour and a half. And we hope that we will be able to organize another session with you, maybe 6 months from now. Or
Perfect.
if you would
I'd
travel.
be, first of all, I would like to thank you very much and to thank CERLAC and York University. Thank you, Lisa, for organizing this event. I am very happy to be again at York University and CERLAC.
You're welcome.
I did my PhD there, as you know, and I have a strong link with Canada and with Toronto in particular, and with York University, of course. So I am very happy. I would like to thank you all, and I will be willing to collaborate. Ecuador is a very small country, and almost nobody talks about Ecuador. So that's why it's important to disseminate some information about our small country, which is very particular and nice at the same time.
Yes. Well, you have certainly helped us a great deal in understanding what's going on. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.